Hey, how's it going, everyone? I wanted to go through really quickly how to properly export your object once you're done with it from Maya into Unity. So a couple things you want to check before you actually go through this entire process is first, make sure your UVs are all spaced out from each other. You can see right now, if I turn off this checker, this is the overlapping UV section. So if I move one of these over, you'll see that this area is a little bit darker because it's recognizing that this shell is overlapping with this shell. So when I apply texture to this, whatever I put on this piece or this piece, it's going to look exactly the same in that area. It's going to take the actual part of that image in that area. So this also can cause lighting issues, especially when you go to bake your lighting in Unity. It's going to run you a couple errors saying like, hey, yeah, you have overlapping UVs or overlapping UV shells. This is going to cause a lot of artifacting, and basically your light map is going to have some errors with it. So it's always general practice to try to move these apart. You can also do this. You could just highlight all your shells, modify layout, unfold 3D, 256, preserve 3D ratios. Yes. I don't really like to rotate my shells. I like to leave them the way they are. This is what I have it set as. You can do that if you want to. You'll have a bunch of these options open up for you. I'm always going to do this as a texture map of 2048. Remember that, and I'll talk about this later on, whatever you set your texture map size to when laying it out, that's how big your light map UV has to also be, or your light map has to be in Unity. And I mean this, so Windows, rendering, lighting settings. It's going to say what size right here. So your light map size, if I have this in Maya at 2048, this has to be at 2048 as well. So it's good practice to try and make sure that every single object that you export is under this. 1024, 2048, 4096, I really wouldn't do that. I don't think you really need that, to be honest with you. 2048 to 1024 D solid. That should be good. Shell padding. So what shell padding is the spacing in between each of these shells. So whenever you're baking, let's say like normal maps, or even like, some diffuser color, there's actually going to be this fine line, or not fine line, but this this line that surrounds or covers the corners and edges of your shells. If your shells are too close to each other, it will automatically inherit some of that line onto that, and you'll just have some weird kind of like mushiness going on where your texture just doesn't bake right. So you could have some overlapping color issues, overlapping normal issues. So it's always good to make sure that your padding is at least 10 to 15. So again, selecting all these. Distribute, full square, make sure the scale mode for all these is uniform. And then just click Layout UVs. There we go. Set that up all up for me. Get out of here. Object mode. It's always good to make sure that your object is also named too, so you can name this SM Pirate Bucket or just, Pirate Bucket. In Unity, it's going to recognize this name. Make sure your history is deleted. So I don't really have any history on this yet, but let's say I add something right here. I add a bevel. Oh no, I have a split right here. Good. My history right now, if I go back to object mode, I have a split right here because I made a cut. I'm going to delete this again. I have it deleted the edge, so I have some history here that I gotta have deleted. This button right here works for that. Or you can also do edit, delete by type, history. It'll do the same exact thing. A couple of things I know. This is going to be a lot of checks and balances here, and keep in mind with me and bear with me here. You want to make sure that everything on your translate, your rotate is all zeroed out. You want to make sure that your scale is also 111. You don't want to have any layers attached to it when you're ready for your final export. You just want this model to be as it is solely. If you guys have issues like you have multiple objects, so like let's say like an entire level in here, I can definitely help you guys out with that with a later video, but this is just for showing how to do one object at the moment. Also, I mean, I could just like separate these. This is multiple objects in one. I could again combine, delete history. We're back in business. Just make sure those are all zeroed out one by one. Next, this object needs to be at the center of the world on the grid. Otherwise, you could be trying to move it around, and if it's not the center of the world, maybe it's a little bit too much to the right. You're going to be having your pivot point right here and your object right there when you're in Unity. You don't want that because you're not going to have good control over it. It's going to be kind of awkward to move it. So best to center your pivot right now. And for me, just because I know that I want to be able to just put this on the floor, I kind of want it to be at the bottom center of the object. So I'm going to center the pivot again, center of it. I'm going to go into my front view, press D as in dog. I'm going to hold V as in Valentine, and you'll see up here, this is the snap to point or snap to vertex tool. So if I hold V, you can actually see it goes from a square to a circle. And I'm just going to hold down the left mouse button and bring this all the way down. It doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, there's going to be some overlapping here where it goes below the grid. That's fine. It's not going to cut off anything. For this purpose, I generally just want to get it as close as possible. I mean, I could even lower this if I wanted to, but right now I don't. I just want it to be where it is right now. I also want to make sure that this is, again, center of the world, right? So I know that it is aligned with this horizontal line. Now I got to get it to where it lines up in the center. I'm going to go into my top view, turn on my grid. Another good snapping tool is the snap to grid tool, which is X. So you'll see that turn on and off. You could also just click that on if you wanted to, and it would do the same thing. Take this and just drag it over there. Now we can actually see that the object, or the pivot for the object, is dead in the center of the world, which is what I want. Just final few things. I want to make sure that, again, I call this pirate bucket. I want to assign this a new material. So holding down the right mouse button, assign new material. And wood bucket. M for material. You can change this color. I don't think it's really going to be represented though, because you're not exporting the material, you're just exporting a name for the material slot, because it only has one material attached to it. That being said though, you can take some faces here. So go into UV mode. I could actually take these 3 shells, or these 4 shells. Wish I could count. I'm going to go to the faces. And I could actually assign a new material to these pieces right here. So maybe I want like some metal branding. You could do this in Mudbox, and you could just make those metallic. That's totally fine. For some things like larger objects, like if you're dealing with like a building, you can just assign multiple materials to it. So again, I can just apply like blend here, metal bands. Now you'll see that the object here has 2. It has a material for the wood bucket, it has a material for the metal bands. And don't be afraid. I mean, I'm going to talk more about why this isn't always the best practice, but it is an option when making textures and when making materials. I will talk about that tomorrow. But generally, for the most part, if you have objects like this, a small object, you want to do one material for it. So again, I could just go into object mode, select it. It'll select this entire object, assign existing material, and just call it wood bucket, and bam, the entire thing is covered by the one material. I'm going to close that off real quick. So, okay, I'm ready to export this. Do File, Export Selection. I'm going to do it in my downloads. It doesn't really matter. This is a static mesh, so we call it SM, Pirate Bucket. I already have something named like that, so maybe I could just call it like Final. This will be the final one I have. The last checks and balances thing here is geometry. Under the geometry tab, we want to make sure that smoothing groups are checked, tangents and binormals, and we want to triangulate it. So anytime that an object is being rendered, the shapes are always cut into triangles when it's being rendered, so make sure that that is triangulated. For animation, we want to make sure this is ticked off. I'm not doing any animations. I don't want any cameras brought in from the scene, no lights, no audio, so make sure those are all unchecked. Make sure your export is an FBX export. You could also do OBJ, it's totally fine. For me, I'm just going to stick with FBX. I know that I'm going to my downloads, and I'm just going to click the export selection button. Good stuff. This error thing will pop up. It's not a big deal. It's just saying there's no smoothing groups or no tangents of binormals. It's totally fine. Don't worry about it. Those are made for checks and balances if you do have smoothing groups. So if your object is in smooth preview mode or 3, it will respect the smoothing groups. But for the time being, it's not a big deal. You just close it or exit out. If the FBX or the OBJ option doesn't show up, Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. You can type in FBX and make sure all 4 of these are checked on, or OBJ. Make sure all those are checked on and just hit close. And those options, again, when you go to export it, will be available in this Files of Type tab. So now that it's all exported, I can go into Unity. I go to Assets, Import New Asset. This is my Pirate Bucket Final. Import it. It's right there. It has the material on it. It has the actual model. So I want to go, I'm going to close off this tab, to the inspector for it. Going to model, I'm going to leave everything the way it is. Do not want to generate colliders. I do want to generate light map UVs. So make sure that's turned on. Don't have to worry about this right now. We will talk about this later on in the week. Everything else here should be fine. Apply. Go to Rig. Make sure animation type is none. Animation, I want to uncheck this. Apply. And then materials here, yeah, I mean, you're pretty much all set here. You only have the one wood bucket material because that's the only one that I put on this. So if you already have your material made in Unity, you could just click this button. And I don't know, you can just add anything you want to it. So it's like a cool one here. You probably skip this one. Double clicking that, it'll have the Mojave Smooth, or just the material name right here. Apply. And now you'll see it has that material on it. Bring them to the scene. Now that being said, sorry about that. I was in UV charts negotiated. That being said, just because I have a material assigned to the actual model doesn't mean you actually don't have to. You can change the material if you want when it's in the scene. So I give it like a red matte, green matte. It'll still respect that. I can go over this more later on in the week. I definitely will. This more deals with like the material of how the actual object is. But here in the inspector now, you can see it has SM Pirate Bucket Final. So the object that we named it. The transformations. It has the Pirate Bucket Mesh, the material that we have assigned to it, and any other issues here, so, or any other things here. So lighting probes, so like reflection and light probes. Additional settings, which we don't have to deal with motion vectors here. And then the material here. But this is just to show you how to bring in at least one object from Maya correctly into Unity. When you guys bring in your levels, I'll have a video on that, hopefully. Bringing in levels is a little bit more difficult just because you're dealing with more pieces, obviously. So, if you look over here in the hierarchy, it just has the actual model here. But if I like group this, so I have like, a couple different groups. Now we're dealing with some issues here where this isn't the best practice for a single object. You always want to have this object by itself. So selecting it, middle mouse button, dragging it to the top, deleting its history, freeze transformations. So it still has all that zeroed out data. You can just delete these. They're not going to affect it. So for single objects, you want to make sure that they're solo. You don't want to have them be a child of a group or anything like that. Make sure that they're solo. I know that I rambled on here. If you guys do have any questions, please don't hesitate to at me or Joe. Always willing to help you.